I'm really honored to be introducing Noam Chomsky, who is someone I have respected and admired for a long, long time. And it's interesting that whenever people who were once on the left are about to move to the right, which happens, the first test for to know what they're about to do is when they try to reassure the people they work for or their colleagues by saying, I'm not part of the Chomsky left. Whenever anyone says that, beware, because they could end up anywhere. And some of them have ended up supporting George W. Bush. Many people who initially started off by saying, I'm not part of the Chomsky left. So that's always a good test. Now, it's difficult to talk about Noam because his work is so well known all over the world. And he wears so many hats and speaks in so many different places that it's not easy to put him in a box and say this is what he is and that's all. But let me try. When I was thinking who Noam reminded me of the most as a public intellectual, the name that came to mind was someone very different from Noam in many ways, but quite similar in others, and that was the late British philosopher Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell, at an early stage in his life, became a conscientious objector, refused to fight in the First World War. Unlike Noam, he came from a very prominent aristocratic family in Britain, you know, one of the oldest aristocratic families in Britain, the Dukes of Bedford. And when Bertrand Russell became very radical and said we have to have a war crimes tribunal to judge the United States for war crimes in Vietnam, we couldn't find a single hotel in London which was prepared to give us room. And we said to Russell, we said, what are we going to do? And he said, oh, this is the first time I've regretted having given up all my inheritance. So we said, but we've got to do, he said, I will make a few phone calls. And the first meeting of the International War Crimes Tribunal on Vietnam was held in the Hotel Russell in Bedford Square, property that had been owned by Russell's family and which he'd given away. I mean, he said he didn't want to be part of it. Now, the important thing about Russell, like Noam, was that he was not fearful of speaking his mind and speaking the truth to heads of state, to heads of governments. I remember once I met him just after some particular atrocity in Vietnam, and Russell had been at some ceremony where the British Prime Minister had come forward to greet him and said, hello, Lord Russell. And Russell said, I could not bear the thought of shaking this man's hand because he backed the war in Vietnam. So he turned his back on him and walked away. And there are people like that around. And Noam Chomsky is one of the few. And this is the voice of America, which we have to defend and promote all over the world. Because if there weren't people, weren't dissidents like Chomsky, it would be very difficult to defend the United States and explain to people that there is an opposition, that not everyone in the United States follows the government, and that often there is a large opposition which is not reflected in the press. And this is what being a public intellectual is all about. And recently there have been a spate of essays and some books, bad essays, published in bad newspapers, which have talked about public intellectuals, and then when you read them, they come up with figures like Thomas Friedman and Michael Ignatieff and Christopher Hitchens and various other jokers. Now, the point is, for me, there are two types of intellectuals. There are these people I've mentioned, and others. We could name quite a few. These, in my opinion, are state intellectuals. They're not public intellectuals. They don't speak in the public interest. They're state intellectuals. They defend the state. They speak on its behalf. They carry on writing in defense of its lies and its atrocities and its crimes as if it was simple. People who all supported the war on Iraq do not care a damn that 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. 100,000 Iraqis. And all these state intellectuals who defend the war in Iraq never speak about this figure because that doesn't bother them. Well, Chomsky does. And he is meticulous in the way he searches the facts, analyzes them, and presents them. And it is to his enormous credit that he does this in a country whose political culture has totally isolated him. I mean, things are not that good in Europe either. I don't want to exaggerate. But if Chomsky was living in France or Britain, he would have a column fairly regularly in any major newspaper in Germany, France, Britain, or Italy. There's no question about it, because things have not got that bad there as yet. They may. But in the United States, this is impossible. It's impossible. And despite this, his voice is heard all over the world, despite the fact that he is treated as a pariah in his own country by the mainstream establishment, as well as by the liberal establishment to a large extent. But despite the fact, this is the one American voice which is respected in Iraq, which is respected by ordinary people in Pakistan, which is respected in virtually the whole continent of Latin America. Why? Because everyone knows that in order to win, you need the support of the American people. You need the support of American citizens, ordinary people. And Noam Chomsky is the one person who gives a voice to many of these people who can never be heard either on the American media or outside. And that makes him extremely important, and that makes him a very precious asset for dissidents and for resistance movements all over the world. And now he's been doing this for a long, long time, nearly 45 years. And this voice has become stronger and stronger and stronger. And the fact that the enemies, his enemies and our enemies in many cases, cannot deal with this forces them to resort to slanders, to lies, because they can't deal with his arguments, even though he's not on television. He's not published regularly anywhere in the mainstream press. His books circulate all over the world, and his voice cannot be drowned. And even this single voice, dominant, powerful, truthful, they don't like. They don't like it. They attack him. People who have endless reams of space in the New York Times and the Washington Post, they can say what they want. They feel obliged to attack him. And it's interesting, this, because they could ignore him if they wished, but they can't. And the reason they can't is because Chomsky's voice has become the conscience of his country and is heard all over the world. And that is the reason why he can't be ignored. I first read texts by Noam 40 years ago at the time of the Vietnam War, and he influenced me, and he influenced many generations. It's the third generation now which he's influencing. And it's wonderful to see him in different parts of the world, especially when he's speaking to young people, a new generation. And you feel when he speaks in his own characteristic fashion, as you will hear soon, when he speaks, and the young listen avidly to him, you feel that he is passing on the baton of dissent to a new generation. And that is an extremely important task today, because we live in a turbulent, unpleasant world. We live in a world where this country has become too powerful and too militarily dominant for its own good. And we need more and more dissenting voices. So my slogan, So I think our slogan has to be, create 2, 3, many Chomskys. I'm very proud to welcome Noam Chomsky on behalf of the Laden Foundation here today.
Thank you more eloquently if I could see you, but it's all black, so I assume there are people there. My last visit to New Mexico was 5 years ago to join in the celebration of the 20th anniversary of IRC. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in the 25th anniversary celebration. Since that time, as you know, the name has changed, the scope has broadened, but the mission remains. The central component, as they put it, is to make the United States a more responsible global partner and to engage citizens in that endeavor. Well, that task was urgent enough 5 years ago. Even at that time, there were warnings from right at the heart of the establishment that, I'm quoting, much of the world regards the United States as a rogue state and the greatest threat to their existence. That happens to be Samuel Huntington, Harvard professor in Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was not alone. Shortly after, the president of the American Political Science Association repeated the same message in very similar words. That was 5 years ago. Since then, the situation has become far worse. It's now not much of the world that regards the U.S. as a rogue state and the greatest threat to their existence, but most of the world, almost all of it, in fact. George Bush his administration has succeeded in a few years in making the United States the most feared and often hated country in the world. Well, one reason for this, obvious, is the invasion of Iraq, which, against extraordinary international opposition, in fact, I can't think of a historical parallel to that. That incidentally includes the so-called coalition of the willing. So at the summit meeting announcing the war, declaring the war virtually, George Bush and his, I'll say politely, associate, Tony Blair, were joined by Prime Minister Aznar of Spain to announce that the war was going to start in a couple of days. At that point, Aznar had support of 2% of the population of Spain for joining in the U.S.-British war. And he was therefore hailed as a great leader of what was called New Europe, the grand hope for democracy. In fact, the performance about New Europe and Old Europe was a very enlightening one. There was a very sharp cry, you remember it, of course. New Europe were the good guys, the hope of the future, the leaders of the democratic crusade and so on. Old Europe were the bad guys, stuck in their old ways, don't have democratic credentials. The criterion to distinguish them was extremely sharp. Old Europe, bad guys, were the countries where the governments took the same position as the large majority of their population. New Europe were the countries like Spain, where the government overruled even larger majorities of their population, huge ones in the case of Spain and Italy, and followed orders from Crawford, Texas. So therefore, they understood the nature of democracy. Perhaps the most extraordinary case was Turkey, which, to everyone's surprise, mine too, the government actually took the same position as 95% of the population and rejected Washington's orders. And they were bitterly condemned by the U.S. leadership, by intellectuals. Paul Wolfowitz, who's identified by the Washington Post as what they call the idealist in chief, leading the democracy crusade, he went so far as to berate the Turkish military because they didn't force the government to overrule 95% of the population and take their marching orders from the boss. And he ordered them to apologize to the United States for this and to make it clear that their task is to help America. Well, that performance was doubly interesting, first because it took place, and second because nobody seemed to notice it and what it meant and what it means about the elite conceptions of democracy shouldn't require any comment. What it means is democracy is fine as long as you do what we say. And we, of course, doesn't mean you and me or the people of the United States. It means the political and economic leadership. And that conception is so deeply ingrained that even in an incredible case like this, it literally can't be noticed. Well, one reason for the deterioration in the position of the United States in the eyes of the world is, of course, the invasion of Iraq. For most of the world, that was the supreme international crime encompassing all the evil that follows. The wording of the Nuremberg judgment, trying the Nazi criminals, including people like the Nazi foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, who was accused and hanged, in fact, for such crimes as preparing the diplomatic background for Hitler's preemptive strike against Norway, which I'll leave the consequences of the conclusion from that to you. The evil that followed was only increased the fear and the hatred. That's, first of all, the fate of Iraqis, as Tariq mentioned. The most probable estimate of deaths done in a careful study several months ago is about 100,000, mostly violent deaths since the U.S. invasion. The number of children suffering from acute malnutrition has doubled. It's now at the level of Burundi, lower than Haiti and Uganda. These matters were barely reported in the United States, and insofar as they were even mentioned, quickly dismissed. In England, there was enough of a response so that the British government had to release a pathetic and embarrassing answer. Here, not even that, and that's a rather important fact that has to be borne in mind for people here who care about their country. That's just the beginning of it. What followed were really serious, outright war crimes. We've just seen one the last few months, the invasion of Fallujah. And in this case, the crimes were not concealed, which may be worse than passing them over in silence. So they were openly reported and, in fact, proudly reported. You could see on the front page of the New York Times a big picture of the first victory in the conquest of Fallujah. The first target was the Fallujah General Hospital, and the Times featured a big picture on the front page of a soldier standing guard over people lying on the floor in hospital gowns with their hands tied behind their backs. And the story explained that the American forces that went in forced patients from their beds, forced them to lie on the floor, and manacled them with their hands behind their backs. The story went on to say that this had to be done because the Fallujah General Hospital was serving as a propaganda weapon for the insurgents by releasing casualty figures. And the Times added, of course, that these are inflated casualty figures. They knew they were inflated because our dear leader had announced that, which is apparently enough. The foundation of contemporary modern post-Second World War humanitarian law, and in fact part of the supreme law of the land in the United States, is the Geneva Conventions. The conventions explicitly and unambiguously state that any medical facility must be protected by any combatants in any conflict. Anything other than that is a major war crime, grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Under current U.S. law, the War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by Republican Congress, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions carry a sentence, a possible death penalty. Maybe our coming Attorney General had that kind of thing in mind a couple of years ago when he was legal counsel to President Bush and advised him in that capacity that he should effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions to reduce the likelihood of prosecution. Well, again, you can draw the conclusions yourselves. All of this was passed over very lightly here, mostly without comment, but not elsewhere. The evil that followed the invasion and is encompassed in the supreme international crime didn't only include Iraq. There are consequences for the rest of the world, too, including Americans. One of the consequences is an increase in terrorism, the kind of terrorism that passes through our doctrinal filters, namely terrorism by others against us. The other kind is not recognized. But that category of terrorism, as anticipated, increased. Before the invasion, there were warnings from specialists, people knowledgeable about the area. Tariq was one of the early ones. In fact, even the U.S. and British intelligence agencies, that the invasion of Iraq would be likely to increase the threat of terrorism. And in fact, those warnings were realized. It did increase the threat. The national intelligence estimate in the United States that was presented to George Bush a month before the invasion, released recently, warned that the invasion would very likely increase the threat of terrorism. Just a few weeks ago, the National Intelligence Council, it's the coordinating body of intelligence agencies, released its projections for the next 15 years, and one of them is that Iraq will now become is becoming and will continue to be a training ground for jihadi terrorists, Islamic terrorists, much in the way that Afghanistan was in the past. They didn't go on to say when Afghanistan was a training ground for terrorists, so let's add that. It was primarily at first in the 1980s when the CIA and its associates, pretty much the present administration or their mentors, organized radical Islamist terrorists from around the world for their own state purposes, created the foundation of what is now called Al-Qaeda and other related organizations. And then again, Afghanistan became a major training ground for terrorists after Clinton bombed the Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998. That led to warmer, closer relations between Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, previously cool, and turned Afghanistan into a training ground for terrorists again. Now Iraq is taking its place. Well, this carries consequences for everyone and very threatening ones. Sooner or later, terrorism and weapons of mass destruction are going to be united. and the consequences could be pretty awful. There are other sources of global concern and fear and anger with regard to the United States, which were evident even before the Iraq invasion. Primarily the stance of brazen contempt for the entire framework of international order that has been laboriously constructed since World War II and is simply dismissed with contempt by the administration. Just to take one of many examples related to terror, the National Intelligence Council report that I just mentioned predicts that a major threat to the United States will be biological weapons. Now that threat can be reduced, and we know how to reduce it. There is a bioweapons treaty, but it has no enforcement mechanisms, and there have been negotiations going on for several years to add enforcement measures to the bioweapons treaty, which would certainly have the effect of monitoring, controlling, and reducing the threat of biological terror that the National Intelligence Council warned against. However, that's not going to happen. In September of 2002, right after the Bush administration released its national security strategy, which sent plenty of shivers around the world, a couple of days later, its point man, John Bolton, informed Europe that there would be no further negotiations to introduce enforcement measures into the bioweapons treaty. The reasons that were given was that inspection, of course that would involve inspection, and inspection might harm the interests of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations. There are also suspicions that Washington wants to conceal illegal bioweapons research and development that it's carrying out. So therefore, the National Intelligence Council is quite right to warn of the increasing threat of biological warfare terror here. However, there are much worse threats than biological weapons, far worse. Nuclear weapons and militarization of space are surely the most serious threats. All of this is of particular significance in New Mexico, because New Mexico is, as I'm sure you know, one of the major centers in enhancing these threats to survival, and in this case we are literally talking about survival of the species. Well, these threats are leading to much more dire warnings than those that I quoted, again from the heart of the establishment. So last summer, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is very sober and respectable and not given to hyperbole, ran an article by two prominent strategic analysts, John Steinbrenner and Nancy Gallagher, in which they pointed out, these are mostly quotes, that the military programs and aggressive stance of the administration carry, in their words, appreciable risk of ultimate doom. And they go on to say that you have to look very hard. In fact, I can't think of a case where such words have ever been pronounced in respectable establishment circles. They go on to say that if the United States is to remain a democracy worthy of the name, the political system will have to acknowledge that the United States is now the dominant threat to everyone else. Their words, the super outlaw state. They go on to explain that the terrifying technology that is being developed in Donald Rumsfeld's transformation of the military will assuredly diffuse to the rest of the world. There will be a competition in intimidation, an action-reaction cycle, creating rising dangers, potentially unmanageable ones for Americans as well. And in fact, that's already been happening. Russia, a year ago, had its first serious military exercises in 20 years. They deployed new offensive weapons, more sophisticated missiles, nuclear-armed, aimed at the United States. U.S. military analysts estimate that Russia may have tripled its military expenditures since the Bush administration came in with its militaristic stance. they have officially adopted the Bush administration's so-called preemptive war strategy, meaning asserting the right of a first strike, even a first nuclear strike, without pretext of defense. Washington's aggressive stance is compelling the Russians, who are much weaker, of course, to transfer missiles thousands of miles from one part of their territory border to another repeatedly. This is over very lightly defended areas. Nuclear-armed missiles, very tempting target for terrorists. Their offensive nuclear system has been placed on hair trigger alert, computer-controlled firing. We know about how the U.S. systems work. Lots known about that. Our systems are also computer-controlled, and there are regular occurrences, frequent occurrences, of the computer systems giving a warning that a missile, that the U.S. is under attack and must respond. The rules are that when such a warning comes, and it is very frequent, there are 3 minutes for human intervention to determine whether it's an authentic attack, and then there's time for presidential authorization, 30 seconds. That's the way our systems work. The Russian systems are far worse, furthermore deteriorating. The threat is being very consciously enhanced, and it's a very serious one. The former Senator Sam Nunn, who was one of the leading figures in arms control, wrote a couple of weeks ago that it is madness for human survival to depend on the hope that regular computer errors will be caught in time. The threat is severe, and he says may well be increasing. Well, we know that there have been very close calls in the past. The most dangerous was discovered in October 2002 on the 40th anniversary of the missile crisis. There was a conference in Havana of high-level participants, those who were still alive in the original missile crisis from the United States, Cuba, and Russia. And they had already known that the missile crisis was, as Arthur Schlesinger put it, Kennedy memoirist and advisor, was the most dangerous moment in history. But they were shocked at what was learned at this 40th anniversary meeting. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from nuclear war. The details, if you like. Two of the leading scholars of the missile crisis who helped organize that meeting, James Blight and Phil Brenner, commented that it is miraculous that the world escaped the nuclear war on that occasion. And it had unusual contemporary relevance in another respect. The missile crisis was in large part a consequence of a major international terrorist campaign. John F. Kennedy's Operation Mongoose, the goal of which was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That's again Arthur Schlesinger's words in his biography of Robert Kennedy, describing Robert Kennedy's goal. He was in charge of these operations, which he made the highest priority for U.S. intelligence agencies. It led pretty directly to the missile crisis and to the miraculous escape. Well, this was the most important news in many years. It was barely reported, literally. And all ignored. Few people even know about it, which raises further questions about the viability of American democracy and reasons why the world should be frightened. We should be too. Without saying so explicitly, the two strategic analysts I mentioned, Steinbrenner and Gallagher, express a very deep despair about American democracy. After outlining the policies that they say carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, they express hope that the policies will be changed, but not from within the United States. Apparently, they don't consider that an option. They hope that the policies that there will be a coalition of peace-loving states which will counter American militarism and aggressiveness, which they hope will be led by China. We've come to a pretty pass when leading analysts in the most respectable journals hope that China can save us from the collapse of American democracy. What that implies about ourselves is pretty shocking. Why did they pick China? Well, explain. First reason is that China has been in the forefront of international efforts at the United Nations to preserve space for peaceful purposes. That has been blocked unilaterally by Washington actually since the Clinton years. Not reported, incidentally, though of extreme importance. It became much worse since Bush took over, right after the national security strategy was announced, which essentially declared the U.S. intention to dominate the world by force and prevent any threat to that dominance. Right after that, part of the implementation of it was a program announced by the Air Force Space Command, shifting policy from Clinton's to a new policy. Clinton's policy was control of space for military purposes. The new announced policy was ownership of space for military purposes, meaning, as they said, the possibility of instant engagement anywhere with highly lethal offensive weapons which can strike anywhere on Earth without warning. The whole world is under surveillance by sophisticated satellite and other systems, sophisticated enough so they can tell if a truck is crossing a street in Damascus or any other place you pick. So the world is at risk of instant destruction. That's ownership of space, and that's a natural spelling out of the national security strategy. This also was, as far as I know, not reported at all, certainly not much. A lot of this is called missile defense, but as everyone knows on every side, missile defense is not a defensive system. It's a first strike weapon. That's understood by U.S. analysts, understood by the Chinese and other potential targets. And we know how the U.S. reacted when Russia installed a very small missile defense system around Moscow back in 1968. The U.S., it's been declassified, immediately reacted by sharply increasing its offensive nuclear military force so as to overwhelm it and to destroy all radar positions and so on. And there's very little doubt that potential targets will react to our so-called missile defense system in the same way. It's apparently being deployed in early stages right now. There's a lot of debate and discussion about the so-called missile defense, a lot of criticism on grounds that it hasn't been tried and it probably won't work and so on. That may be true or may not be true, but it's kind of missing the point. The system is far more dangerous if there's some appearance that it might work. That's what's going to impel potential targets to do exactly what the United States did in the case of a much more primitive and insignificant missile defense system in 1968, namely to expand their offensive military capacities to overwhelm it. So the real danger is that it might look as though it's going to work. Well, that brings us to the second reason why Steinbrunner and Gallagher hope that China will lead a coalition to counter U.S. aggressiveness. The reason, as they say, is that of all the nuclear states, China has been the most restrained in the development and deployment of nuclear weapons. In fact, it's done very little. However, that's changing. Now, China, too, is reacting to Rumsfeld's transformation of the military, just as the Russians have done. They've recently announced sharp increases in development and deployment of offensive military weapons, advanced missiles, nuclear weapons, and so on, contributing to the action-reaction cycle. All of this is vastly more dangerous than Iran's alleged programs, even if you assume that all the charges are true. And that's happening right here, in fact, right here in New Mexico, and not being reported. Well, these few examples, which are really a scattered sample, should be enough to show that there's quite a long way to go in fulfilling the IRC mission of making the United States a more responsible global partner. and should be enough to indicate that despair about the state of American democracy is so extreme among serious, respected analysts in mainstream circles that they actually express the hope that outsiders, led by China, can somehow rescue the world from the failed political system in the United States, which has turned the United States into an outlaw state, in their words again, the dominant threat to everyone else. Well, the election of last November strongly reinforced that feeling in much of the world. It also led to a good deal of despair and sometimes hopelessness among Americans, at least those who are concerned about the fate of their country and the world, and the concerns are very real. They include the likelihood of terminal war, terminal nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, the enhanced threat of terror, plenty of domestic concerns, the very dedicated effort to dismantle the achievements of the past popular struggle in the past century, now being systematically dismantled in an exercise of fraud that is truly awesome. The con game about Social Security is a pretty striking, stunning even example of sheer audacity and contempt for the population and faith in the enormous power of public relations as an instrument of deceit. I won't run through the details, I assume you know them, but it is pretty stunning. Well, that faith in public relations as an instrument of deceit may well be warranted. After a few weeks of intense propaganda, a large part of the population, particularly young people, have come to believe that the Social Security system is in fact in crisis, which is too ridiculous to discuss. The war in Iraq was sold in the same way. In September 2002, and that is a month that will go down in history if history continues. In that month, there was a huge propaganda campaign initiated by our next Secretary of State, who warned about that the next thing we'll hear from Saddam Hussein is a mushroom cloud over New York. Within a couple of weeks of government media propaganda, the American population was simply driven entirely off the spectrum of world opinion, fearing Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, ties to al-Qaeda, probably involvement in 9/11, and so on. Saddam Hussein was hated almost everywhere, certainly in the countries that he had invaded, Kuwait and Iran, but he was feared only in the United States, not in those countries. And that, incidentally, remains true. Some striking recent statistics on that. Right now, it turns out that about 75% of the American population think the United States should not have gone to war if Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda. Well, the belief, nevertheless, roughly 50% think the U.S. should have gone to war, even after the government's own report, the Kay and Dilfer report, have completely exploded those charges. Well, there's actually no contradiction there. People still believe it, despite the refutation. Roughly half the population still believes that, yes, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or programs to develop them and ties to al-Qaeda terrorism. And it's not surprising that they do. If you read the report of yesterday's committee hearings on the Rice nomination, the Senate Majority Leader, Bill Frist, gave a statement justifying the war, and he said, outlaw regimes must be confronted, nuclear weapons proliferation must be stopped, terrorist organizations must be destroyed. Therefore, we were right to invade Iraq. Didn't matter that it's known beyond dispute that they weren't involved in nuclear weapons proliferation and that they had no ties to terror, though now they're a terrorist haven. As for confronting outlaw regimes, few thoughts come to mind, but I'll leave it there. The faith in the power of deceit is shared in the places that matter, in policymaking centers, in particular in the business world. We all know this. Corporations spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year in advertising, which is not an effort to inform, but it's an effort to deceive, as we all know. If you want to find out the characteristics of, say, the cars that Ford is going to produce next year, or of drugs or other commodities, you don't turn on the television set to see ads. The goal of the ads, is hundreds of billions of dollars, is to project imagery, first of all, to create artificial wants, and secondly, to delude you into satisfying those created wants with one commodity rather than another, more or less identical one. The commitment to deceive is pursued with real fanaticism. That's demonstrated not only by the scale, literally hundreds of billions a year, but also in other ways. So recently, though it wasn't reported here, there were negotiations with Australia to establish what's called a free trade agreement. There's nothing to do with free trade, and certainly not an agreement, but that's what those things are called. The negotiations were held up for some time because the United States was objecting to Australia's highly efficient healthcare system, maybe the most efficient in the world. The prices of drugs are a fraction of what they are in the United States. Very same drug, produced by the same corporation, which makes a ton of money in Australia, but makes maybe 10 times that much for the same drug here. Why was the U.S. objecting to the Australian system? Well, because the Australian system is evidence-based. That's the phrase that was used. That means if a pharmaceutical corporation wants to advertise by showing a sports hero saying, this drug is, ask your doctor if this drug is good for you, it's good for me, or something like that, often not even telling you what it is, they're not allowed to do that. They have to provide evidence that the drug actually does something, that it's better than some cheaper thing that's already on the market. And that evidence-based approach, the U.S. negotiators argued, is interference with free markets. Because corporations must have the right to deceive. That's crucial. Australia sort of backed off on that, but the claim itself is kind of amusing. I mean, even if you believe the free market rhetoric for a moment, the main purpose of advertising is to undermine markets. If you go to graduate school and you take a course in economics, you learn that markets are systems in which informed consumers make rational choices. That's what's so wonderful about them. But that's the last thing that the state corporate system wants. It is spending huge sums to prevent that, which brings us back to the viability of American democracy. For many years, elections here, election campaigns, have been run by the public relations industry. And each time it's with increasing sophistication. And quite naturally, the industry uses the same technique to sell candidates that it uses to sell toothpaste or lifestyle drugs. The point is to undermine markets by projecting imagery to delude and suppressing information, and similarly to undermine democracy by same method, projecting imagery to delude and suppressing information. The candidates are trained, carefully trained, to project a certain image. Intellectuals like to make fun of George Bush's, use of phrases like misunderestimate and so on. But my strong suspicion is that he's trained to do that. He's carefully trained to efface the fact that he's a spoiled frat boy from Yale and to look like a Texas roughneck, kind of ordinary guy just like you, who just waiting to get back to the ranch that they created for him to, throw a cow over his shoulder or whatever you're supposed to do on a ranch. All of this is careful training, ordinary guy. Meanwhile, Kerry is trained to be a goose hunter and a motorcycle rider and so on and so forth. The other imagery seemed to work marginally better. But the important thing to do is to keep people from knowing the stands and positions of the candidates on any issue, or the parties. And it sort of works. Take a look at the last election. Right before the election, people were asked, potential voters were asked on what are the grounds for your vote going to be. About 10% said they were voting on the basis of the candidate stands on issues, agendas, policies, and ideas. 6% for Bush voters, 13% for Kerry voters. The rest are voting for what are called qualities or values in the PR industry, which is, of course, all meaningless. There is a measure used by political scientists called issue awareness. To what extent are voters aware of the stand of the candidates they're voting for on issues? Well, that hit an all-time low in the year 2000, lowest recorded. This election, 2004, was even worse. You can't measure it because the voters tended to assume that the candidates shared their opinions, even when the party platforms explicitly rejected them. The suppression of information was so effective and the projection of imagery so overwhelming that the voters literally just took for granted, well, I don't know what these guys stand for, but probably for whatever I want. That was extreme for Bush, but it was also true for Kerry. Unless you give a very sympathetic interpretation to vague statements now and then that most voters never even heard. The imagery for Bush, he was supposed to project an image as an ordinary guy just like you, also a strong leader, going to protect you against terror and so on. In fact, the major component of the Bush vote was people who were concerned about terror. Actually, the Bush administration had acted consciously to increase the threat of terror. The invasion of Iraq is a striking example of it. Not because they want terror, but because it just doesn't matter very much. It's not a high priority. It's just like the risk of nuclear destruction. They don't want it. It's not a high priority. There are many other examples of that, some of them pretty striking. So the Treasury Department has a bureau called Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, which monitors suspicious financial transfers around the world. Well, it's obviously a core element of the so-called war on terror. Every year they report to Congress what their activities are. They reported last spring that they have, OFAC has employees who are tracking the suspicious financial transfers that might be related to al-Qaeda or Saddam Hussein. Four people on their staff are doing that. 5 times that many are investigating suspicious transfers that might be an effort to undermine the U.S. embargo against Cuba, which has been declared illegal by every relevant international forum, but it's 5 times as important to make sure that we can strangle Cuba than it is to monitor transfers of al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Well, that didn't get reported either, but it again tells you what the priorities are, and there are many more examples. Also, Bush was supposed to stand up for your values. That's something that was projected. What are the values? Well, those are pretty easy to determine. All you have to do is read the business press the day after the election. It was describing euphoria in boardrooms in New York and around the country. Why euphoria in boardrooms? Well, certainly not because CEOs are opposed to gay marriage. In fact, their attitudes are what are called liberal. But those are the values that are the real ones. We also learn the values of the administration by observing their fierce dedication to transferring costs to the next generation, and serious costs, environmental costs, fiscal costs, even the cost of ultimate doom. Let's turn to the Kerry voters. The strongest support for Kerry came from people who were concerned about things like health care. Well, what was Kerry's health care program? Actually, very few people know. It's hard to find out. Certainly never stated in any understandable way. The New York Times, after the last debate, 2 or 3 days before the election, the New York Times commented on the debate. It was supposed to be about domestic issues, that Kerry didn't make any hint about possible government involvement in healthcare programs, because that position has, in their words, no political support. Well, according to the most recent polls, about 80% of the population think that the government ought to guarantee health care for everyone, and furthermore regard it as a moral obligation. Tells you something about people's values, but there's no political support. Why? Well, because the pharmaceutical industry is opposed, the financial institutions are opposed, the insurance industry opposed, so there's no political support. Doesn't matter if 80% of the population regard it as a moral obligation. That doesn't count as political support, which again tells you something about the elite conception of democracy. Well, the importance of avoiding issues, as was done very successfully in the election, the importance of that was brought out very clearly right before the election. The U.S. had a very opinion in the United States and attitudes is very carefully monitored and controlled. We know a lot about it. Two of the most respected institutions that monitor public attitudes released major studies timed for the election. They came out in September, right before it. And the results were extremely interesting and surprising. Turns out that a large majority of the population thinks the United States ought to join the International Criminal Court. It ought to subject itself to judgments of the World Court. It ought to join the Kyoto Treaty. It ought to, that the UN, not the United States, ought to take the lead in international crises, including use of force. In fact, a majority of the population even believe that the United States ought to give up the veto at the Security Council and follow the position of the majority, even if it doesn't like that. With regard to the use of force in international affairs, the general population takes keeps to what a rather conservative interpretation of international law, of the UN Charter, that the use of force is legitimate if you're under attack, of course, in self-defense, or if there is an imminent threat of attack. So there's nothing to do except resort to force. That's a very large percentage of the population. Notice that both political parties reject everything I just said, reject it so much that it's not even discussed. So the bipartisan consensus and the media completely reject the position of the large majority of the population on all of these issues. And it continues like that. A large majority, very large majority, thinks we should concentrate on domestic spending, about 80% for health care, similar figures for education, other domestic spending, and those figures have held for a long time. I should mention that these studies were barely reported. In the national press, not even mentioned. So little reporting, I could actually list the newspapers where they appeared. The only reasonable conclusion from this is that media, it's obviously of extreme importance right before an election. It must be, I can't think of any other explanation, that media leaders understand, as well as political managers, that the public must be deluded, misinformed, and marginalized. The same is true on Iraq. So within a few months after the invasion, by about April 2003, a large majority of the population thought that the UN ought to take over. It ought to take responsibility for economic reconstruction and political transition. A few months later, same majorities held that the UN ought to take responsibility for security in Iraq. Well, let's go back to Spain for a minute. In March 2003, Spain was very highly lauded for leading the marvelous New Europe because Aznar took his orders from Crawford, Texas, with the support of 2% of the population. In March 2004, an election came along, and Aznar was voted out. and Spain was bitterly denounced for appeasing terrorism. What was the position of the new government? Well, the position of the new government was that Spain should not have troops in Iraq unless they're under UN authorization, which happens to be the position of about 75% of Americans at the same time. But there's a difference between Spain and the United States. In Spain, people know what public opinion is. In the United States, it takes an individual research project to determine what it is because it wasn't reported. Furthermore, in Spain, they could vote on it, not in the United States. Neither political party would touch such an opinion, and that's why Spain was denounced, because voters took the same position as the large majority of the American public. Well, that tells us something, too. I couldn't find any comment on that. There seems to be something paradoxical about all of this. The facts of the matter, of which this are a sample, seem to conflict with the grand contemporary theme, namely that the mission of the United States is what's called democracy promotion. In particular, what the liberal press calls the president's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq. That's a vision that suddenly surfaced as the reason for the war, after all the other pretexts for the invasion have disappeared, but people were polite enough, commentators polite enough not to notice that. And in fact, there was near unanimous awe for the president's messianic vision. Critics said, well, maybe it's noble and inspiring, but maybe we can't carry it off because of their cultural failings and so on and so forth. Actually, there was one sector of opinion, I should say, that didn't agree with this, the only one I could find, namely Iraqis. At about the same time that the president announced his messianic vision with enormous awe and acclaim, I couldn't find a word here questioning that this was the reason for the invasion after it was announced. Right at the same time, this is last November a year ago, the Washington Post did report a poll taken in Baghdad where people were asked what they thought the reason for the U.S. invasion was. And some agreed with 100% of articulate opinion here that it was to bring democracy to Iraq. 1%. 5% thought that the goal was to help Iraqis. The rest said the unspeakable here, that the goal was to take control of Iraq's resources and reorganize the region in the U.S. interests, the large majority. Iraqis did agree with American commentators in seeing a cultural problem, but they didn't see it in Iraq. They saw it here. It's a cultural problem here where people are willing to believe the word of their dear leader without any other evidence, and that is a problem. They're right about that. Actually, Iraqi opinions were somewhat more nuanced. The same poll showed that although 1% thought that the goal of the invasion was to bring democracy, about half said the United States want democracy in Iraq, but the U.S. will make sure that it will influence and determine its course. And that's correct. That's what democracy means. Democracy means you can have elections, you can do anything you like, but you better do what we say. Iraqis apparently understand that, and we choose not to, and the word choose has to be emphasized because there's plenty of evidence. Well, let's go back to democracy promotion, the great contemporary theme. That's led to a huge literature. There's a whole cadre of scholarly experts now on democracy promotion. The most renowned of them is Thomas Carruthers. He's the director of the Democracy and Rule of Law project at Carnegie Institution, many books and articles. He's highly supportive of this leading theme of U.S. foreign policy since Reagan. He just published a new book in which he reviews the achievements of the last 25 years of democracy promotion since Reagan. And intelligent man, he finds what he calls a strong line of continuity in all administrations. Namely, they're all schizophrenic. They all have split personalities, in his words, which is a very strange phenomenon. I'll give you his description of it. Where supporting democracy was consistent with U.S. economic and security interests, the U.S. stands up for democracy. Where democracy clashes with economic and security interests, democracy is downplayed and ignored, and the U.S. supports dictators and torturers. So democracy is fine, but as long as you follow orders. Same principle as always. Actually, the interesting, it's getting late, so I won't give more examples, but I can't bear not reporting the way this is described in the business press the last few days with regard to Iraq. Now, the Wall Street Journal yesterday has an article by their Iraqi specialist which says the following: in Baghdad, the men likely to lead Iraq's next government promise to demand withdrawal as soon as they take power after Sunday's election. Then it says, problem in the United States. Here's the way we respond. President Bush and his aides refuse to be pinned down to such a plan. Here comes Condoleezza Rice. I'm really reluctant to try to put a timetable on that because I think the goal is to get the mission accomplished. The mission is to establish democracy by rejecting the demand of the elected leaders. And then it goes on to explain that they hope they'll be able to pressure the democratically elected government to accept a compromise in which they will accept vague promises to withdraw rather than a firm timeline. Well, Tony Blair chimed in today in the London Financial Times with a long interview, also full of the great mission of bringing democracy, and he says, there is no way that the United States and UK will set a timetable for the withdrawal of their troops from Iraq. A deadline is not being contemplated because we must stay the course to bring them democracy. Somehow this is all done with a straight face. Don't ask me how, but it's pretty impressive. Well, final comment. The last election did lead to a lot of hopelessness here, but it's important to bear in mind that the election told us essentially nothing about the country, just as we would have learned nothing about the country if there had been a slight shift in voting patterns, if the democratic imagery had been a little more effective, and it had given Kerry 31% of the electorate instead of giving Bush 31%. We would still have learned nothing. The reason is that there was no election in any sense of the term that is worth taking seriously. The political system, including elections, is carefully managed to prevent the threat of democracy. The actual views, and that's very clear from the suppressed information that came out about people's actual views. If you take a look at those actual views, the actual views of the public, who are of course excluded from the system, they provide a pretty respectable agenda for carrying forward the task of making the United States a more responsible global partner. What's needed is to create, in part to recreate, a functioning democratic society in which an informed public can participate in formation and implementation of policy, domestic and international, in the political sphere and the economic sphere as well. Well, that's hardly a very utopian ideal, and it's not an unmanageable task. If we fail to undertake it successfully, we don't have anyone to blame but ourselves for what will ensue, which may turn out to be very grim. Thanks.
Noam, if we could sort of start by discussing Iraq. As you said in the concluding parts of your speech, even the elections which are taking place in a very limited way might produce a government which could demand that the United States leaves Iraq. Traditionally, the United States, unlike the European empires, has preferred to rule indirectly. They don't like being present. They send the Marines in when they have to, but they prefer to rule countries through local relays who do the dirty work themselves. So, I mean, Iraq is a very complex situation, but theoretically, there is nothing to stop them from withdrawing the troops if they are convinced that the government there is going to do their bidding.
Well, if they're convinced of that,
Yeah.
But how can they be convinced? In fact, if you, well, I don't have to tell you, let's just imagine what the policies might be of an independent Iraq, independent sovereign Iraq, let's say more or less democratic. What are the policies likely to be? Well, there's going to be a Shiite majority, so they'll have some significant influence over policy. The first thing they'll do is reestablish relations with Iran. Now, they don't particularly like Iran, but they don't want to go to war with them, so they'll move towards what was happening already, even under Saddam, restoring some sorts of friendly relations with Iran. Well, that's the last thing the United States wants. It's worked very hard to try to isolate Iran. The next thing that might happen is a Shiite-controlled, more or less democratic Iraq might stir up feelings in the Shiite areas of Saudi Arabia, which happen to be right nearby, and which happen to be where all the oil is. So you might find what in Washington must be the ultimate nightmare, a Shiite region which controls most of the world's oil and is independent. Furthermore, an independent Iraq is very likely. You know more about it than me, so I'm interested in hearing what you think. But my guess is that an independent sovereign Iraq would try to take its natural place as a leading state in the Arab world, maybe the leading state. And, that's something that goes back to biblical times. What does that mean? Well, it means rearming, first of all. They have to confront the regional enemy. The regional enemy, overpowering enemy, is Israel. They're going to have to rearm to confront Israel, which means probably developing weapons of mass destruction, just as a deterrent. So here's the picture of what they must be dreaming about in Washington, and probably 10 Downing Street, I don't know who does the thinking there, that here you might get a region, sovereign, independent, substantial Shiite majority, including most of the world's energy, rearming, developing weapons of mass destruction, to try to get rid of the U.S. outposts that are there to ensure that the United States controls the oil reserves of the world. I mean, is Washington going to sit there and allow that? That's kind of next to inconceivable.
I think that this is a big problem.
It is.
Massive problem for the United States, that this entire rhetoric about democracy could implode in their face. Because if you haven't, which is why something tells me that these elections are going to be rigged. I'm referring to the Iraqi elections. That they will, the way they're setting up the voting pattern, that lots of Iraqi exiles in Britain and Europe can vote, it's unheard of, actually. The way they're setting up the elections inside Iraq itself in some areas is very dubious. The model they have is the elections in Afghanistan, which were a total fraud. And the reason they're doing it is to make sure some of their hardcore people come into the new assembly. But despite that, I think you're right, Noam, that despite all the chicanery, they might still have a government which A, wants them out, and I cannot see even a weak Iraqi government, dependent on occupation troops, agreeing to allow Iraqi oil to be controlled by non-Iraqis. So Iraqi control of Iraqi oil, no foreign troops in Iraq, could become the big demand, which means that the war will go on.
Yeah, if they agree to that. But I think what I just read from the business press in the last couple of days probably reflects the thinking in Washington and London. Well, okay, we'll let them have a government, but we're not going to pay any attention to what they say. Yeah. In fact, the Pentagon announced at the same time, 2 days ago, we're keeping 120,000 troops there into at least 2007, even if they call for withdrawal tomorrow. And the propaganda is very evident right in these articles. You can write the articles now, the commentary. We just have to do it because we have to accomplish our mission of bringing democracy to Iraq. And if they have an elected government that doesn't understand that, well, you know, what can we do with these dumb Arabs? You know, actually, that's very common. I mean, look, after all, the U.S. has overthrown democracy after democracy because the people don't understand. They follow the wrong course. So therefore, following the mission of establishing democracy, we've got to overthrow their governments.
The thing is, if they're thinking seriously, they should be thinking that if they do that and make the government, you know, even elected in these weird circumstances, totally useless, the people who've elected it could begin to move towards joining the armed resistance groups in Iraq. That's a big danger for the United States.
But remember, these guys have a lot of experience. The same Thomas Carruthers, who's interesting. He's the smartest of the lot, and there are a lot of them now. He points out, he's a great believer in what he calls Reaganite programs of enhancing democracy. In fact, he participated in them. He was in the State Department in the Reagan years as in the democracy promotion projects. And he describes, he's written the main scholarly books and articles on what happened, and it's pretty frank. He doesn't seem to understand what he's saying, just as in what I quoted, but it's frank. I mean, he says the Reagan programs were, of course, noble and inspiration, but they were a failure, and a very systematic failure. Namely, he points out in the southern cone of the hemisphere, where the United States had very little influence, there was real progress towards democracy, which the Reagan administration tried to stop, but couldn't stop, and therefore reluctantly accepted it. In the regions where the U.S. has the greatest influence, nearby, there was the least progress towards democracy. And even that, he says, was constrained by the fact that the U.S. would only accept top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites allied to the United States remain in power. But that's a noble vision. That's a wonderful program. We're bringing democracy. And these appear, he's regarded as a liberal commentator, like he appears in Dissent, for example. And this is taken serious. I'm sure people who read these articles that I just quoted didn't laugh, although I don't exactly know how. And there's a long history of it, just as there's a history of projecting the United States as a model of democracy when it's almost a prototypical example of a failed state, a state with democratic forms but no functioning.
I mean, just carrying on those lines, let's assume that the situation gets worse. Large groups in the south begin to join the resistance. That will require more troops from the United States to try and control the resistance inside Iraq. Given that we have this strange situation in the United States that the reserves are drying up, that fewer and fewer people are volunteering to join the army, more are volunteering to join the Navy and the Air Force because they're safer. Could this push the government to introducing conscription?
Could, but I suspect, my guess is, I think that's going to be a last resort. And the reason is the Vietnam experience.
Yeah.
The Vietnam experience, I think, is the first time in the history of European imperialism that an imperial power tried to fight a colonial war with a citizens' army.
Yeah.
I mean, the British didn't do it. They fought with Gurkhas and sepoys and so on. Yeah. The French had the Foreign Legion. Colonial wars, civilians just are no good at. I mean, they're too brutal and vicious and murderous. You just can't take kids off the street and have them fight that kind of a war. You need trained killers, like the French Foreign Legion. And in fact, you could see it happening in Vietnam. To its credit, the army fell apart after a couple it took too long, but finally the army essentially fell apart. The soldiers were on drugs, they were fragging officers, not following orders, and so on. And the top brass wanted them out. You look back at the military journals in the late 60s, they were writing about how we got to get this army out of here. The army's going to collapse. But pretty much like the head of the reserve said 2 or 3 days ago. He said, this is becoming a broken force. People can't do it. Well, they dropped conscription at that point and shifted to what's called a volunteer army, which in effect means a mercenary army of the disadvantaged. So army recruiters don't go to the high schools and colleges in the suburbs. They go down to the poor areas and try to offer inducements to poor, disadvantaged people to go into the services. And that way you do get a kind of a mercenary army. But even that is limited. I mean, you really need professional killers. And I suspect that's the reason why they're bringing in so many of the, what do they call them? The MPRI and DynCorp, the contractors, the military contractors. Yes. You kind of privatize it to trained killers, like South African mercenaries or the, ex-officers in DynCorp. Then you get people who can do that kind of thing. Actually, I think by now the second largest contingent in Iraq, greater than the British, is the contractors, which means basically trained killers. But do they have enough of them?
I don't think they have enough of them, and there are not that many countries which will like to supply them either now. And the British army is in a mess, and a number of leading British generals have said, if the local population turns against us, one colonel actually said it on television. He said, if there is a large demonstration of 200,000 Shia people outside our barracks, I'm not going to give the orders to open fire. I think that'll be time to come back home. So whether or not Blair wants it, there could be rebellions inside his army. As it's quite incredible.
I don't know about you, but I've been extremely surprised by what's happened since the invasion. My own guess at the time was that the invasion would take about 2 days. Iraq was a broken country, very scarcely held together with Scotch tape. If that hadn't been true, they would never have invaded. They knew it. And I thought it would be the easiest military occupation in history. Here the country had been practically wiped out by sanctions. It killed hundreds of thousands of people. It was barely being held together. I mean, here, people talk about how glad they were to get rid of Saddam Hussein. I presume they were even gladder to get rid of the sanctions. But you can't ask that question, so we don't know the numbers. But here, sanctions are over. They got rid of the tyrant. The United States can come in with enormous resources. I mean, just to give one amazing fact, they still have not reached the level of electricity of the pre-invasion period. I mean, my guess is that, a couple of students from MIT could probably have put that grid together by now. But they have taken a situation which should have been an extremely easy military occupation and turned it into a total catastrophe. And in fact, what's happened is that the U.S. has backed off step by step from its initial aims. You read the press now, it sounds as if the U.S. wanted an election. That's just not true. The U.S. was opposed to elections. It tried in all sorts of ways to develop some kind of system which would prevent elections, a caucus system that they could control, some other trickery. And they had to back off. They had to back off on the privatization. Not totally, but Bremer's initial proposals, which are outlandish, they had to back off on. And in fact, if you think about it, I think it's a remarkable triumph of nonviolent resistance. I mean, it's not the guys throwing bombs that bother them that much. It's the steadfast refusal and resistance of the large majority of the population to accept these demands. It's an astonishing achievement. How it'll proceed, I don't know. I mean, with all the resources that they have, I assume that they can somehow manage to impose the plans that they now describe. We will force them to accept vague promises of eventual withdrawal and count on Tony Blair and George Bush's speechwriters to give the right the formulation of it.
It's going to be difficult, actually, for one simple reason, that I think most Iraqis just don't like being occupied by a foreign power.
Well, if you finish you didn't get the chance yet to read Blair's full interview.
No, he said it's not an occupation.
Not only that, he said he's furious about people who think it's an occupation, which happens to be about 99% of the population of Iraq by his own polls.
Noam, if we move to another thorny question in the Middle East, which is that you don't just have the occupation of Iraq, you have the continuing occupation of Palestine by the Israelis. And on this question, it seems to me that public opinion in the West has almost given up, because the way it's presented, it's too complicated. When suicide bombers are presented, it's presented in the United States largely, but also in some parts of Western Europe, completely decontextualized. Arafat's death was sort of more or less celebrated in a vulgar fashion by large sections of the American media. A new person, Abu Mazen, has been elected, and now there are hopes that he will do what the Israelis want him to do. But he is not capable of doing that. He's not able to do that. Eric Hobsbawm, the English historian, said recently that if the Israelis carry on behaving in this fashion, the state of Israel as constituted at present might not exist by the end of the century. Now, who knows? But what do you think are the first 3-4 steps to a solution?
Well, I think they're pretty clear. And once again, actually, I actually did an article after the death of Arafat in which I went through the American media to see how it was treated. And it was
horrendous.
Amazing. But some of it was quite revealing, though. So, for example, the New York Times has an intelligent Middle East correspondent. He wrote a major think piece on the death of Arafat, front page story in the Times. It started by saying that the death of Arafat will offer a test for the quintessential faith of Americans that elections legitimize even the weakest systems. That's the first paragraph of the article on the front page. If you go on to the continuation page, to the last paragraph says the Americans would never accept elections before because they knew that Arafat was going to win. So that's the quintessential faith. You know, quintessential faith is elections are fine if they're going to come out the way we say. Yeah. Now, go to popular attitudes, which are extremely interesting and, as usual, suppressed. These same major public opinion agencies, and they do careful studies, found that, right now, in fact, about the percentage of Americans who think that the U.S. ought to tilt towards Israel is 17%. It's 17% of Americans think we should be more favorable to Israel. If you look at the in-depth studies, not reported, what they show is that a large majority, about 2/3, think that we should accept what's called here the Saudi plan, which is just the latest version of the two-state proposal that the U.S. has been blocking for 30 years. That's a large majority of the American population. Neither political party would even dream of it. Same large majority, roughly 2/3, think that the United States ought to cut off aid from either party, either Israel or the Palestinians, who are not negotiating in good faith on a two-state settlement. Well, that means cut off aid from Israel. Same majority says if both parties are negotiating, we ought to equalize aid to them. I mean, that is so radically different from anything in the political arena or any word you can read in the media that they don't know what to say about it. And what's interesting about all these numbers, including the ones I quoted before, is that these are opinions of people held in isolation. I mean, everyone who's answering those questions must think I'm the only person in the world that thinks this. They've certainly never seen it anywhere, never heard it anywhere. I mean, if it was possible to discuss these questions, if there was some functioning form of political democracy with organizations and discussions and debates and so on, that would just reinforce the opinions. It would be much stronger. Well, that's a possible solution. In fact, it's on the table. In fact, as you know, it came pretty close. The Clinton Camp David proposals were totally impossible, and Clinton basically conceded that. A couple of months after Camp David 2000, he came out a couple of weeks before the end of his term with what were called the Clinton parameters, which were pretty vague, but much more forthcoming than the Camp David proposals, which were impossible. And that led to negotiations in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001. Clinton, when he, a couple of weeks after he announced his parameters, this is right at the end of the term, stated that, gave a speech in which he said that both sides Palestinians and Israelis have tentatively accepted his parameters, and both sides have reservations. Well, that's what was discussed at Taba. And the negotiators came to a conclusion that was not going to work as it stood, but was very close to the old international consensus the U.S. had been blocking. Well, Barak called off the negotiations. Then we get to a cycle of violence. But they continued. And there are now several versions. The best established one are the Geneva Accords, released in Geneva in December 2002, I think, 2002, which were supported by just about the entire world. The United States was the only major country that wouldn't even send a low-level delegate or make a comment about it. So they're dead. Well, they could be a basis for settlement. They're not perfect as they stand, but they're certainly a basis for settlement. And in fact, it's a possibility. It's been a possibility since the mid-'70s, and it remains a possibility if the United States will accept it. And the population overwhelmingly accepts it, but neither political party does. The media don't. There's no discussion possible about it. The degree of falsification about this is just mind-boggling. I mean, take, say, Tony Blair this morning. He's supposed to be the intelligent European.
He's a European.
You're prime minister. You're responsible for half European, maybe a quarter. But in his interview this morning, which is quite interesting, he says he's confident that within the next few weeks, the United States his good friend George Bush will take the lead in taking the matter in hand and so on and so forth. But what's the problem that has to be taken in hand? Well, the problem is security for Israel, period. The Palestinians have to agree to ensure security for Israel. Not one word about what the major issue is. What about the occupation? What about the fact that the so-called Gaza withdrawal proposal is really a West Bank expansion proposal?
Exactly.
I mean, the same day that Sharon announced the Gaza withdrawal, his government also announced tens of millions of dollars of new construction in the occupied territories. Just a couple of days ago, they reported that secretly last summer, Israel had passed what was called in the New York Times a clarification of the absentee ownership law. The clarification allows Israel to confiscate without compensation lands of Palestinians living in what they call the seam, the area between the separation wall that they're building through the West Bank, between there and the border of Israel. Well, that means they can just take over more and more territory. It means somebody who's living in Bethlehem and whose olive groves are 10 yards away on the other side of the separation wall has lost ownership of them because he doesn't occupy that land. So therefore it gets confiscated. These programs of development, integration, infrastructure development, new settlement, and so on, that's what's undermining any political settlement. And the U.S. is supporting them, and Britain's keeping quiet about it.
I know.
And they go on all the time, and that's not considered a problem.
I mean, the notion that Israel, which has the fifth strongest army in the world, which has nuclear weapons, which has a stockpile of chemical weapons, could be threatened by any of the existing Arab states, leave alone the Palestinians, is just grotesque. I mean, they're trying to project the situation which did exist in 1948 to what exists now, when they themselves became totally transformed and are the most threatening power in that region. And it always worries me, coming to the United States, that the media here, in particular, just is completely blind to Palestinian suffering. It doesn't exist for them.
But that's been true
for a long time.
Ever since the U.S. shifted policy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically 1967. I mean, prior to that, the New York Times was not a pro-Israel newspaper. In fact, as you go back to the 1950s, the American Jewish Committee, its journal commentary, It was a non-Zionist journal. In fact, the Zionist organization actually set up a competing journal to express the Zionist point of view. Changed dramatically in 1967, and it finally changed in 1971. That's the crucial date there, which is effaced from American, not only media, but even most scholarship. In 1971, Egypt, Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty, right in terms of official U.S. policy. Jordan followed right along. The Israeli government discussed it, debated it, recognized that they could have peace and security and be integrated into the region and so on, but at the cost of giving up expansion. And expansion at that time meant primarily into the Sinai, where they were, this is the labor government, they were kicking out thousands of farmers and planning to build an all-Jewish city in the northeastern Sinai. That was the choice. Is it going to be expansion or peace? Well, they chose expansion. They rejected the offer. Crucial question was, what's the United States going to do? And there was an internal debate, and it was won by Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor. And his policy, as he describes, was stalemate. No negotiations, only force. Okay, that led to the 1973 war, very close call. Finally, in Camp David in 1978, the U.S. and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. That's called a triumph of American diplomacy. A total disaster. You know, the refusal to accept it led to a dangerous war, almost a nuclear confrontation. For Israel, it was a very close call. Enormous amount of suffering. Well, you know, by then they finally agreed, okay, they'll give back Egyptian territory, but by then they were expanding into the West Bank with U.S. funding and support over the opposition of the American population. And so it continues. But the solution to this problem is, you know, there are problems where it's hard to think of a solution. But here it's easy to think. It's not a pretty solution. It's, you know, I think it's a horrible solution, frankly, but it's a solution which would at least cut back the level of violence, would allow relations to establish, which might ultimately lead to something sane in the region. And it's sitting right there. All it requires is that the opinions of about 2/3 of Americans be taken into consideration.
We are approaching the end of this session. Lots of you have sent in questions, but look, reading the questions, we have covered many of the things you've asked. There's one question which we haven't discussed at all and haven't covered, and that's the one I'm going to pose to Noam. This is from a member of the audience, who in your opinion is the most important anarchist thinker?
Well, any person I would mention is automatically disqualified because any honest anarchist thinker would simply immediately reject the description of being the most important anarchist thinker. Actually, probably the most important anarchist thinkers, at least that I know of, are poor, illiterate peasants in Aragon and Catalonia in 1936, who actually constructed a successful live anarchist society over a large area, industrial and agricultural. Most of them were illiterate. They left documents. So there are some documents left which are extremely interesting. And it wasn't spontaneous. This had been after efforts that had been going on for 70 years. Efforts that were attempts, crushed, try again, you know, educational programs, all sorts of things. Finally, in the first year of the Spanish Revolution, it broke out and flourished. And it was so terrifying to everyone that every single power combined to crush it. The fascists, Russia, liberal democracies, put aside their differences to ensure that this would be crushed. And after they crushed it, they went, you know, they fought the war as the War of Succession. Well, you know, they were probably the most important anarchist thinkers. And the same's true everywhere. You take a look at the, say, IWW in the United States. I mean, those were important anarchist thinkers who actually carried out actions, which led finally to the development of the American labor movement, which had been bitterly suppressed. The U.S. has a very violent labor history. Actually, you know about it around here. But their activities and others like them finally did lead to substantial successes. There's major attacks against them since, but those are successes of people who are constructing worker-managed, community-run societies, which is kind of an anarchist ideal. And this is very deeply rooted in the United States. People forget what it's like. I mean, there was a period in American history in which there was substantial victories for democracy through the 19th century. It was called, people who write about it call it the period of self-rule. It was based on the assumption, which is very widespread in the United States, that wage labor is not very different from slavery. I mean, that was the slogan of Northern workers who fought in the Civil War. In fact, it was even the slogan of the Republican Party. It was, slavery is, of course, unacceptable, but so is wage slavery. You have to control your own fate. You read the newspapers written during the period of the freest press in the United States, the late 19th century, where working people were running their own newspapers, communities, and others. People in the mills in eastern Massachusetts, origins of the American Industrial Revolution, their press is what we would call anarchist. These are, Irish artisans from the slums of Boston, farm girls from what they called factory girls, young women coming off the farms into the mills. They just took for granted that those who work in the mills should own them, and that we should create our own self-managed society, integrating with others. That's a deep part of American history. It takes a lot of effort to crush it.
On that utopian note, I think we've come to the end of the evening. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Noam.